Well, thank you so much for having me here. I've had a wonderful visit to Emory so far. It's actually my first visit to Atlanta. And I want to say a special thank you to Amanda Lewis, Professor Amanda Lewis, for inviting me, and to Professor Michael Owens for his kind introduction. I've been asked to share with you today the thesis of my book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, and to a large extent, the title of the book speaks for itself. I argue that today, in the so-called era of color blindness, and yes, even in the age of Obama, racial caste is alive and well in America. The systematic mass incarceration of poor people of color in the United States amounts to a new caste system, one specifically challenged to meet the economic, political, and social challenges of our time. Now, I fully recognize that the central claim that I make in this book is difficult for many people to swallow. In fact, for a long time, I resisted this notion myself. There was a time when I believed that those who made comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery, or mass incarceration and Jim Crow, were engaging in exaggerations or hyperbole, and that those kinds of comparisons were more likely to do harm than good to efforts to reform the criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. In fact, the first time that I encountered the idea that our criminal justice system might be functioning like a caste system, I dismissed the idea out of hand. I was rushing to catch the bus in Oakland, California, and this bright orange poster stapled to a telephone pole caught my eye. And I remember pausing for a minute and scanning the text of the flyer, and on it it said in bold print, "The New Jim Crow. The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And there was a small community group that was holding a meeting several blocks away to protest the new 3 strikes law in California, the expansion of the prison system, the drug war, police brutality. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, the criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make those kinds of comparisons. You know, people just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street, jumped on the bus, on my way to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU. Now, when I joined the ACLU, I already had years of experience as a civil rights lawyer and advocate. I had been working primarily on employment discrimination cases. I was working for a small plaintiff-side civil rights firm that specialized in class action employment discrimination litigation. And we were suing large Fortune 500 companies like Home Depot and public supermarkets and Safeway stores for race and gender bias in their hiring and promotion practices. And so I understood very well the ways in which, unconscious as well as conscious bias and stereotyping can infect subjective decision making at all levels of an organization with, disastrous consequences. So I thought, well, I'll just use all the tools that I developed, in the employment discrimination context and apply them to criminal justice reform and work with others to root out racial bias, wherever it might rear its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to realize that I had been dead wrong about the criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. And the activists who post that sign on the telephone pole, they weren't crazy, nor were the smattering of lawyers and activists around the country that were beginning to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of racial control. So really quite belatedly, and only after years of immersing myself in these issues and in the communities most affected, did I finally come to see that mass incarceration truly was functioning as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racial control analogous to Jim Crow. I state my basic thesis in the introduction where I write, "What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Now, like I said, I reached this conclusion reluctantly. But after years of working on issues of racial profiling, police brutality, drug law enforcement in poor communities, and attempting to assist people, quote unquote, re-enter into a society that never seemed to have much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences which began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that seems so obvious to me now that what is perplexing is that I had been blind to it for so long. Now, I had a number of experiences that contributed to this awakening, but one in particular I'll never forget. There was a young African-American man, no older than 19, who forever changed the way I viewed our criminal justice system and my role as a civil rights advocate. He walked into my office, actually a conference room, late one afternoon, and I was spending my day conducting interviews, one after another, of young black men who had been victims of racial profiling by the police. We had launched a major campaign against racial profiling in California. We called it the DWB Campaign, the Driving While Black or Brown campaign, which eventually became a national campaign. But at that time, we were just in the beginning phases, and we had launched the campaign and created a hotline for people to call if they believed they'd ever been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. We called it our DWB hotline number. And we put up billboards in Oakland and other places around the San Francisco Bay Area, saying if you believe you've ever been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race, call this number. And we announced it, on the evening news, and within minutes, we received thousands of calls. Our system crashed temporarily. People were calling, sometimes in tears, saying, thank God somebody's finally doing something about this problem, And we received, thousands and thousands of complaints, which we, went through in hoping to find potential spokespeople for the campaign, but also potential plaintiffs, because we were looking to file suits against other law enforcement agencies in the state. We'd already sued the California Highway Patrol for racial profiling and their drug interdiction practices, but we were looking to find other potential plaintiffs to sue other departments as well. And this young man comes into the office with a stack of papers like this. He had documented his stops over a 9-month period of time, times, dates, witnesses, even names of officers, badge numbers in some instances. There had been a targeted operation going on in his neighborhood, a sweep of his neighborhood over a several-month period of time, and young men were being stopped, frisked, sometimes brutalized by the police, and he had an unbelievable amount of documentation regarding the dates, times, locations, witnesses. And he was charismatic and engaging and well-spoken, and I just thought, this is a dream plaintiff. Not many people walk in with this kind of documentation and evidence to back up their claims. And I got excited, and I kept asking him more and more, and he's telling me more about the stories, providing more information. Much of it was corroborated by other stories we had heard from his neighborhood. And then he said something, and I paused and said, wait, did you say you're a felon? Did you say you have a criminal record? Because we had been screening people for a criminal record.